Hi. We're really delighted to be here today as part of the COVID conversations by the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute. Today we have with us Gayathry Venkiteswaran. Is that correct?
It's okay. Yes, thank you.
I'm still working on the pronunciation. I apologize about that. I think, but for those who know Gayathry, she really doesn't need much of an introduction, but I would like to give one for her. She is the executive director of the Southeast Asia Media Alliance. She's a media activist in Malaysia. She's of course a university assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, teaching courses about media. She's written books and edited books on Myanmar and on Malaysia, on other parts of Southeast Asia. So we're really honored to have you with us, Gayathry, today.
Thank you so much, Bridget, for this introduction. I really look forward to the conversation.
So I wanted to ask you, how do you think the media environment has shifted during COVID-19? What do you think are things that people need to know?
So I think that, and this is also an area that you are very interested in. COVID has happened and hit us in Malaysia also almost sort of like simultaneously as the political change that happened in February. Of course, we had already begun to see the sort of like spread of COVID earlier in the year, and the Pakatan Harapan government that had been in power at that time was beginning to respond. I think one of the most important things and the stark differences I can see just sort of like in that transition of the political change in February 2020 was that we were actually sort of seeing a much more open environment for the media since the 2018 elections. And we can talk a little bit about what we mean by openness in a more critical way. But I think a general sense of actually the media being able to actually access more information and have a much more critical view suddenly then sort of like went back into a I'm going to even say pre-2000 and, pre-2000 sort of an environment. So we've come into this COVID pandemic with the media actually having quite a bit of restrictions. So we want to know information. It's a global crisis, right? Everyone is in search of information. We do have very good media outlets that are providing us the kind of critical analysis, the information, but they are facing restrictions. And I think that the approach by the Pakatan national government in addressing this sort of like vacuum of information, which is very typical in any form of crisis, is to be a lot more controlled. And I think that is actually quite a very worrying, or at least a sad observation of what the change has been in terms of the politics. So we've come into this now 2-3 months of the pandemic with concerns about what information is out there. Can we trust the information? We have this sense of this report every day from the senior minister. Oh, we have now detected how many cases of false information, fake news. We've this many arrests, as though he's in competition with the health minister in talking about the number of cases affected by the pandemic itself. So there is this sense of wanting to control that has, I think, really crept in. So it brings back memories of, a time when media was so restricted. So I think this is an important time to really see and assess, look, have we actually been able to achieve the kind of freedoms, openness? And it's sad to say that at a most critical time, we are seeing the media actually facing some kinds of constraints.
So you're actually describing a situation where we have greater restrictions at the same time, greater need for information. Are citizens actually getting their information in a different way now?
So I think if we think about the Nipah virus many years ago, 20 years ago, it was quite a different situation at that time, where I would say that there is a kind of monopoly of information by institutions. So either the official, the state, even the media institutions, there's a certain kind of monopoly of information. And I don't mean monopoly in the sense that it's just one source, but it's a very concentrated source of information. But of course, with the digital revolution now, you're not reliant solely on information that comes from the state, as well as information processed by the media. So you can access information, most typically, social media, through your WhatsApp, and also just browsing any other sites. So we are in a situation where we don't have to rely. We are not tied to that. But it also means that we're dealing with so much of noise. How do we make sense and navigate through that noise? And this is where I say time and time again that we may not like the media that we have. We may have issues with certain political biases, but there is a role for some kind of processing of information that is useful for us. So there is a lot of information we can access. But again, I would say that it may apply to those who have that access, that affordability. It doesn't apply to everyone on the ground because you have different conditions. The digital divide is still very much a real issue. So it's also very selective, the kinds of information that people receive. Whether that information is what you really need to make your decisions. Should you go out? Should you not go out? I would say that there are two key observations. One, information that is coming from the official sort of channels can be quite confusing. We've seen that actually quite, in a negative way as well. It creates a certain kind of confusion within the public. That is because it's coming from an official or official sources. Second, people are getting all kinds of information, including, it ranges from remedies to also, is it safe to eat something that has come out of a factory that workers have been tested for COVID. And, people are fearful. There is uncertainty. You're not sure. Who do I trust in this environment? And I think a lot of that uncertainty also comes because generally Malaysians have this on the one hand, I don't trust the government or the institutions. Number two, at the same time, there's a certain kind of a patronage, feudalistic sense. I still listen to someone in authority, So all these, I think, make it very difficult to say if indeed people are getting the information that they need. Because I think the exercise of political choices is also a growing thing. And so you get information, but it may not necessarily be the one that you need to make those decisions that keeps you safe, that insists on accountability, governance, right? How many people are actually interested in checking on the kinds of processes, procedures that come with this pandemic measures, the budget? People are struggling on a day-to-day basis. So I think there is a level of confusion. And so in that sort of noise environment, you choose what maybe reassures you. And that's sometimes not the official information or news, unfortunately. So yeah.
Your recommendation is for people to find the sources that they feel the most trustworthy from their own perspective, or how do people as individuals begin to navigate these noise that people are in, and of course dealing with the issue that there is this high level of unknowns and fear? Well, what will your advice be? Sometimes they tell you not to watch the news at all, to kind of tune it off. What would you say to somebody listening?
Yeah, I think that it's of course it's a tough sort of ask also for everyone who, as I said, have to deal with the daily choices, daily decisions. I think it is really necessary to choose. Again, I would say leave the political biases aside and say if there is an indication that the information has been verified, it's basic media literacy. If we can actually share with people as much as possible, to at least use that as a guide. And then fine, talk to people, talk to your friends, to your family. You cannot avoid that. I think to ask people to not trust among their own people they are close to is also asking for the unreasonable. But I think to have a much more open conversation and say, okay, if we can try to get 2 or 3 other sources and see what's happening. Let's get into that practice, even in our own groups of WhatsApp or any other social media groups. I think these are simple things that we can ask. We cannot ask for the impossible, but it is being aware that that there are some processes that happen within newsrooms that help us at least understand how that information was obtained and what it can actually give us in terms of accuracy. But at the same time, you can also look for other opinions, other critical analysis that challenge some of this. I think that we need to be open to content that challenges each other, but also to be aware not to only use emotions as a way of reading information. Also think about, some of the basic information in there. I think we've missed a few opportunities, I would say, in trying to get media literacy as as part of a sort of a public issue. And I think this crisis really shows why we should have really had a good media literacy program, either at schools or other spaces.
What would you do in a media literacy program?
So we've done in my past life doing advocacy and public campaigns. We worked with individuals, we worked with community groups. We talked about the media environment. We talked about what actually happens in newsrooms, how information is obtained, processed, and then put out, who owns the media, so that you are able to judge whether, despite its ownership, would there be some level of credibility in the process anyway that you can still rely on. Because I think that while it's important to know who owns the media, I think it's not the only thing to sort of fixate on and then say, I reject it because you're owned by a certain group of people. Because you have agency as well. All of us have agencies. What can we take out of that process? What do we do with that information? So we've done this, and it's small scale. As an NGO, you do you can't reach out to the public at large. And we talk about also exercises in which interviews are done, because everything from the selection of the story to what gets into the final output is it is a process of selecting. So there are biases that come into play. So we also try to get people to think about those issues as well. So it is about the processes, it's about the ownership, and what roles individuals have in engaging with the media and saying, I'm unhappy with this because of this, because I think you're unethical or you've been unprofessional. We need to have a stake in what the media puts out, actually. And those are the things that we can actually include in media literacy sort of campaigns.
I want to turn back to the issues of COVID-19. So you've talked a little bit about the issues of restrictions in the context of Malaysia, how things have changed. What about the rest of the region? What's happening in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so in the past, we've seen in my work looking at Southeast Asia, we always said that why is it always a race to the bottom rather than a race to the top? Whether you look at the Reporters Without Borders Index or whether you look at Freedom House Index or any other form of index, you find that whatever gains that any of these countries have made in the past, either because of the political transitions or civil society action, have really seen those spaces actually shrink. So just within the context of COVID, we've heard in Malaysia, some people sort of like yearning for the few months that the Anti-Fake News Act was alive in Malaysia, thinking that that would have solved a lot of our problems. But in the region, you look at Singapore with the protection from the online misinformation or disinformation act. We've seen decrees being introduced in the Philippines and Thailand, specifically in dealing with the pandemic, where the provisions include, or at least powers are given to the Prime Minister and the President respectively, to take action against information deemed to be fake news. They all use the word fake news and false information. In Myanmar, they're actually looking at amending a law on the prevention of communicable diseases, where one of the provisions they're including now is also to take criminal penalties against anyone who puts out false information. We've seen arrests around the region for people who have posted information on Facebook, Twitter. Now, these are individuals who, again, you are fearful, you hear something, you think you want to share it with your friends and your family. You don't have the means to check with all of the authorities. So you put it out because you're concerned, or maybe you think, I should warn somebody. And these people have been arrested. So it's across the board in Southeast Asia, even in Indonesia, where we'd like to say that they have better sort of indicators of democracy and freedom. Also, same thing. There is a real problem of hoax that we've seen during the elections, for example. And so there is actually an order under the police to be able to actually arrest anyone who's putting out such information. So you can see that with the measures to counter the pandemic, immediately there are provisions specifically on content that essentially, I think, show up the weaknesses of the state in dealing with the pandemic, rather than actually much more sort of like fake news in its sort of actual meaning itself. It is about criticisms against the government in dealing with the pandemic. So we've seen that happen ever since March, actually, the number of cases and arrests, for example.
So you talk about new regulations and new kind of a new media climate. Have there been particular incidents where journalists have been targeted? Things that that are really incidents that you think people should be aware of?
So this is So if you take Malaysia, I mean, look at how the pandemic has been used actually to prevent journalists from different media outlets to cover state legislative assemblies and even parliament yesterday. So the pandemic is an excuse to restrict coverage, access. So that's actually, I would say it has been a long time. And I mean, I'm not a historian, but I think it's been really a long time since journalists are prevented from covering assemblies and blocked like that, and only restricted to state and the official media in Malaysia. So that's actually something that we should be worried about. Now, if that can happen for the state legislative assemblies, what else? The daily briefings by the Majlis Keselamatan, National Security Council, is also only confined to the state and official media. So this is something to actually be worried about. In other countries, again, this has been used as an excuse to also limit coverage or to target certain kinds of media. Cambodia, Philippines are among the cases, among examples. And access. Access is the biggest threat, I would say, in that sense, because it becomes an excuse. The pandemic becomes an excuse. And that's so common, really. We see not just in the region, but also other places.
So if we're looking at, a kind of different environment for journalists and for media, how about media outlets? One of the things we're hearing is that media outlets are facing more financial strain as a result of the pandemic. That there's part of it has to do with the economic and regional slowdown. Part of it are other kind of features that are coming in. People have to go about doing their reporting very differently. So what is the kind of other kind of constraints that we see in this media COVID-19 media environment?
Yeah, so we don't know what the environment is going to be, but already we can see that there are media that have announced either changing completely to online, but that started already even before this COVID, but exacerbated by the fact that you've seen a huge dip in advertising revenue, for example, expenditures, and also the fact that subscriptions are down. Sales has been going down quite dramatically. Even though I would say that consumption of information has gone up because a lot of people now are at home and they've been consuming information. What has gone down is the public expenditure on travel and all of those things, and that's affecting all the other industries that then affect the media as well. So journalists are seen as a cost. So every person you hire is a cost for the organization. Sad to say, and I think some of the companies will actually really downsize and restructure if they haven't already begun to do that. You can rely on online platforms for interviews and, sure, I mean, we're doing this right now because we are not able to do this face-to-face. But there's only so much you can capture because the role of the journalist is also to get the story from the ground. A lot of them have been on the ground covering even in the most difficult times. So we are missing out actually also what is the story from the ground, the voices from the ground. So it's now come to a point where we're really centralizing the sources of information much worse than before. So the voices from the people are really, you see them scattered through different social media platforms, but not through the mainstream, the main channel. So that's actually one of the biggest losses, I would say. And because journalists are not able to be on the ground, they have to also, I don't think they have enough equipments to sort of protect themselves. Not because I think anyone is malicious and not giving them, but I think resource is a big issue. So we saw yesterday in Parliament that a lot of the journalists had to wait outside because they couldn't actually gain entrance in. So this really affects their ability to work and access stories, because it's not just about covering the debate, it's also being able to reach out to MPs who are there, because there are other issues to follow up as well for the public. So I think that we are seeing the media suffer some of these huge financial cuts if they haven't already been suffering. We saw that actually happen already through 2017, 18, and definitely in 19. And today it's also going to affect the ability of journalists to work. And if they lose their jobs, they really have nowhere else much to go. The market is too small, for example, in Malaysia.
How about in the rest of the region? Are things similarly having the same dynamic outside of Malaysia?
Definitely. I would say that the countries that have had good economic sort of indicators have been able to support sort of independent media outlets, have been able to support investigative journalism, but those are also feeling the pinch quite badly. In countries where the economy is not so strong, despite opening, for example, in Myanmar for a brief period, where they used that opening in order to have more media, they've not been able to survive because they just don't have the economic strength to be able to support the cost of running the media, advertising, any kind of revenue. So, you can go online, but again, are we all connected enough so that everyone can have that access? And that's definitely an issue. I don't think just saying that let's go online and move digital will therefore solve these problems. I think that's, we're not at that level yet. We still have to address large sections of population in Southeast Asia that are not as connected or connected fast enough, right? Or regularly enough to be able to access that information. So the infrastructure is not enough to cope with that. So I think as media outlets, big or small, think about it in the region, it's not just to make a decision and say, okay, let's move and migrate online. It's also thinking about how that information has to go out to as many people as possible. I'm worried that it becomes more niche. So you target smaller groups and work on that as your, okay, we'll just focus on that. And then you're going to just exclude large groups of people in society.
Very interesting trends. You talk about fragmentation, the importance of digitization, the digital divide, the reinforcing of vulnerabilities. All of these things are really very important trends. I mean, when you kind of look ahead, say, we're going to look back on this in a couple of years, go back, what do you think the kind of imprint will have been for COVID-19?
Wow. I think I'm going to use COVID-19 and reflect maybe a little bit on some of our own political milestones and say that media outlets that were able to respond and come up with something that, to your question earlier, to meet that need of society would, I think, set the bar for what we see in terms of media access to information and the media industry. I know a lot of them are struggling. And I'm just thinking about 2008. I'm thinking about 1999. These are moments when there are people who tie or their experiences are tied to that alternative sources of information without romanticizing any particular outlet or whatever. But I think the ability to say there's something else better out there to set that standard. I think they tend to be able to stay on, or at least influence the others in the industry. So, to put it very bluntly, I would say that Malaysia Kini, was able to set a certain standard because there was a need that they fulfill. And if you look at the information that they provide today as well, with the tracker, with the different kinds of analysis, it is saying we can give you something else more than some of the others. So I think it's trying to think about that. It doesn't have to be sophisticated all the time. It's really understanding what the need is at the moment and saying, can we give it to them or not? Which is why I think even some of the more legacy media will fail. They might exist, they might continue to exist, but they will fail to capture the imagination because they are not really thinking out of the box. They are not thinking about connecting the last mile or whatever, in terms of audiences and also the readers and viewers. So I think it's those who understand what need there is and try to respond to that. And I think that works for any other sectors as well, even education, I think, I think that's really quite remarkable. So, people think about Malaysia. You may not support Malaysia Kini. You may be on the completely different political divide, but you are bothered by Malaysia Kini, right? Even if you don't agree with them, you're bothered by them. And that to me is an impact already, to say that actually there's something else that can set the standard of what information is about or journalism is about. So I think that's what we will see. I think coming out of this COVID, and in terms of information architecture, in terms of media, who's going to be the one to say, well, we actually really came close to being the one to give you what you wanted and keeping those in check, really, right? I hope we think of it in that way and not just sort of reduce it to, the sort of more routine-based information. I hope we think of, this kind of not just trendsetters, but really saying, how do we keep raising the bar when it comes to media and information?
So you're saying adaptation, setting yourself on the stage, looking at feeding the sets of needs of different groups. Then obviously some of the more legacy media is also going to be more effective than other parts of the legacy media to adapt. But will there be newcomers, you think, or do you think that that will come through in this type of environment? Is there COVID-19 showcasing a different type of niche that is not interested so much in the politics, but more interested, say, for example, in the science or the kind of the more less focused on stories of one side or the other? Are there new niches that you think are going to come up?
Well, I think there will be, and I also think it's going to serve a very small. So the word niche is really very, very appropriate, because it's going to be English speaking, English reading. Not that it's a bad thing in itself, but it also means that I think its longevity is going to be also curtailed by its effectiveness, whether it's going to be effective or not. Because actually, if there is, in fact, an outlet like that that can reach out to a broader population, that would be great, because we do need that. A lot of people think that there's too much information out there. I'm a believer of there not being enough information, actually. I think there's not enough. Again, yes, I use the word noise myself to say there's a lot of noise. Yes, that's true. I was a bit worried when WHO actually used the term infodemic in discussing some of these things, because it sort of, creates also a very negative perception towards people who are attempting to challenge sometimes what is the mainstream view or the establishment view. So I'm a bit worried about use of terminologies like that. I think we need more information, and I think it needs to go out to more people rather than the smaller fragmented markets. I think there are a couple of initiatives that focus on health and also processing the information as we go on now. So on a scientific, and we need that. We actually need that to be able to inform policymakers and also the legislators. But that's not good. That's not effective enough to get a kind of a mass understanding of issues. I just heard an interview with Tan Sri Jamila, for example, saying, look, we need to have the mass acceptance of, why it's important to have the lockdown. We don't have it yet because information is not really catered to the general understanding of things, I think. I don't think there have been any outlets that have come out sort of out of this pandemic and that would promise, to sort of like challenge the players already. I think the ones who have had experience being the underdogs have now, I think actually still have the advantage. And I would also maybe come back to just one background for Malaysia, in that media is so political, that I think it's the political changes that's happening that might feed into the newer outfits. So unfortunately, it's not going to be sort of, disconnected from that political change. So if we do see, and we have seen actually outfits come out, but very much, riding on that political change. So I think we are not going to see sort of star newcomers in terms of media, or, it doesn't have to be news. It can be other kinds of outfits as well. I don't think so, because I think actually that kind of political baggage is still very much a key factor.
And of course, it's tied to money as well.
Very much.
Well, Gayathry, we really appreciate this conversation, and we really look forward to continuing to have more. This is Gayathry Venkiteswaran and of University of Nottingham, sharing with us the issues of media. And we wish everybody to stay safe, stay inside when you can, and of course, look at the media with a degree of suspect, but at the same time, a general sense of literacy, as you were emphasizing.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thank you very much.